It's Hackers on Planet Earth. We are starting day 5. It's so exciting. It's been a fantastic event so far. Incredible talks, informative workshops, fantastic interaction, dogs howling and barking in the background. What a smorgasbord, so to speak. This is an exciting session. I think you're going to enjoy it. Zhang Jiquin is a China-based educator and writer, and he's very involved in enabling students, in changing education so that it is not just the intellectual skills, but also the skills necessary for lifelong learning. And we've had quite a lot of changeover across the world in how education is delivered in home-based environments during lockdown, and also trying to identify what are the goals, what are we actually trying to do. It's a moment of self-reflection. Let's hear the presentation, and we will have some discussion after the presentation. Thanks for joining us on day 5 of Hackers on Planet Earth.
This is my first hacker conference. I'm really thankful for the organizers of this conference, Hackers on Planet Earth, for giving the opportunity to share my thoughts, my experiences on the coronavirus, what it's meant for education, and what we can do about it. Basically, I want to argue today that coronavirus has done two things. First thing it's done is it's revealed the fundamental failings of our school system, namely that it is structured around extrinsic motivation rather than intrinsic motivation. Our schools today are built for the convenience of adults rather than for the learning of students. The second thing that coronavirus has done is given us this tremendous opportunity to reimagine and rebuild the school system to ensure that all students can thrive, whether rich or poor. And we can do that by focusing on teaching meta-learning strategies. And I want to share with you my innovation this morning. It's called Theories of Learning, or the Learning Journal. Even though this is my first hacker conference, I've been to many education conferences. And I'll be very honest with you here. If I never get invited back to another education conference in my life, I'd be okay with that. I'd be very happy with that. But I'm very happy to be here with everyone. And the reason why is I actually see myself as a school hacker. My job is to go into schools and help schools reimagine their curriculum and pedagogy to be more creative and to be much more resilient. And I do that not by throwing money around because I don't have any money, or directing policy because no one actually listens to me, but by getting teachers to reimagine their relationship with students, by seeing the invisible forces that happen in the classroom, and by encouraging them, by giving them confidence to believe that they can, through subtle changes, change the life trajectory of their students, just as my teachers changed my life trajectory when I was a student. So there are 3 things I would like to do this morning to argue my case for the Learning Journal. First thing I like to do is talk about meta-learning strategies and what the Learning Journal is. Second thing I like to do is talk about the science behind Learning Journal, specifically the Dunning-Kruger principle and deliberate practice. And the third thing I like to do, which is the most important thing, is I like to discuss possible ways we can collaborate together to reimagine and rebuild the school system so that everyone benefits, teachers, students, in all countries, in all cultures. One 100 years from now, we're going to look back at our current school system and think we're barbarians for imprisoning our children the way we do. We know that all children are curious, they're creative, they like to collaborate. But we deny their natural instincts, their natural tendencies, and we lock them up for 8 to 10 hours a day in a classroom where we expect them to compete against each other to win the praise and attention of adults. We basically create a real life version of the Hunger Games in our school system, and it's destroying and crushing the souls of our children. So why do we have the current school system? Why have we built the schools the way we've built them? We have done so because of a fundamental misunderstanding of what learning is. And we can attribute this failing to Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule. As many of you know, Malcolm Gladwell, a Canadian journalist, he wrote a book called Outliers. And in his book, he argued that if we do anything for 10,000 hours, we become an expert at it. We become a master at it. And in his book, he offers 3 examples of this principle at work. The first example is when Bill Gates was a 13-year-old lanky teenager in Seattle in the 1960s, his private school got itself a computer. And he fell in love with programming. And he programmed for 10,000 hours before founding Microsoft and becoming a billionaire. Second example are the Beatles. The Beatles was this obscure English pop band with really bad hair. They were playing in strip clubs and bars in Hamburg, Germany for 10,000 hours before they went to the United States and became world famous. And the third example is Malcolm Gladwell himself. He says that he spent 10,000 hours or 10 years working as a journalist before writing his first bestseller. Now, what's compelling about the 10,000 hour rule is that it sounds right. It conforms to the way we've structured our school system. We think that if we get our kids to work really hard, they'll be good at it. And so in schools, we get our kids to study a lot, do a lot of homework, and we think that by the time they graduate university, when we hand them that piece of paper, the diploma, they become expert learners. But we know this isn't true. We know this isn't the case. So why is the 10,000 hour rule wrong? And here I want to explain 2 theories to explain why the 10,000 hour rule is wrong. The first is called the Dunning-Kruger principle, and the second is called deliberate practice by K. Anders Ericsson. So let's first talk about the Dunning and Kruger principle. Dunning and Kruger were 2 American psychology professors. They were teaching an undergraduate psychology class, and in the class, they ran a very interesting experiment with their 500 or so undergraduates. They first had their students take a test of logical reasoning, and then they asked the students to guess how they think they did on the test relative to their classmates. Did they place in the top 5%, the top 10%, or the bottom 5%? And what's interesting is that not one student got his or her class ranking right. The very best students thought that the test was pretty straightforward and pretty easy. And so they thought that, oh, everyone must have thought the test was pretty straightforward and pretty easy. So they underestimated the performance. The very worst students didn't really understand what the test entailed, and they lacked the ability to figure out the standards for assessment. So they became very overconfident. They thought they did better than they actually did. In fact, the most confident students were the worst performing students. And this is what we call the Dunning and Kruger principle, where students don't really have a good sense of self-assessment. In fact, in their later experiments, Dunning and Kruger discovered that self-assessment is the most difficult part of learning. And that's why coaches are so important in the learning process, because they help us gauge our true ability and provide strategies for us to improve. And the Dunning and Kruger principle explains why the 10,000 hour rule is wrong. You could spend 1,000,000 hours doing something, but unless you have an understanding of your true ability and where you can improve, you will never actually improve. In fact, there are thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of artists, musicians, writers out there who think that as long as they work hard, as long as they invest their entire career, their entire life in their passion, eventually they'll become world famous. And that just isn't true. And so that's the fundamental misunderstanding and failure of the 10,000 hour rule. And the Dunning-Kruger principle explains to us that self-assessment is actually the most important part of learning. So then the question is, how do you teach self-assessment? And in the experiments, what Dunning and Kruger discovered is that in order to learn self-assessment, the only way is to become more competent at the activity. Now, this sounds like a chicken and egg problem, doesn't it? In order to be good at something, you need self-assessment. But in order to learn self-assessment, you need to be good at something. But what this is really telling us is that if we really want to teach meta-learning strategies, if we really want to teach self-assessment, it's more important for kids to learn one thing really well than to learn many things very badly. But the problem with schools, of course, is that we have most of our kids learning many things very badly. So the second theory that disproves the 10,000 hour rule is called deliberate practice. And the irony here is that Malcolm Gladwell actually based his theory on deliberate practice. K. Anders Ericsson was a Swedish psychologist who in the 1980s spent a lot of time at a music academy in Berlin. He was interested in this question: why is it that some aspiring students of music became professional musicians while others did not? And to answer this question, he went to this music academy in Berlin that was renowned for producing world-class violinists. And he divided the students into three groups: the great students, the average students, and the mediocre students. The great students were students who would become professional violinists. The mediocre students would just become music teachers. And he did a regressive analysis to figure out what factors came into play in producing a world-class violinist. And he discovered that, yes, actually, the very great musicians did spend more time practicing as students than the other students. And that became the basis for Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule. But he also discovered that there's actually much more going on than just the amount of time invested. It wasn't just that the great students were spending more hours practicing. It was also that while practicing, they were working harder. They were exerting themselves much greater. They were pushing themselves out of their comfort zone. They were constantly self-reflecting and discovering their weaknesses and designing learning strategies in order to compensate for their weaknesses. What K. Anders Ericsson also discovered was that the great students also had a certain personality type. They were very humble. They were constantly soliciting advice and feedback from professors and from their peers because they wanted to get better. They were intrinsically motivated. They just loved music, and they wanted to share their love of music with everyone else. And they were resilient. They saw failure as a learning opportunity. They had what we call a growth mindset. To understand deliberate practice, let's use an analogy. Let's just say that you want to work out, you go to the gym. How do you know if you had a good workout or not? Well, it's really about how much you sweated, right? It's about how sore your muscles are. We know because after you've had a really good workout, after you exert yourself really hard in the gym, you go home and you rest. And it's during this period of rest that your body turns fat into muscle. It's rest that allows for muscle formation. Well, learning is really the same thing if you think about it, because the brain is also a muscle. In practice, in school, during class, you really want to focus. You really want to concentrate. And the greater your concentration, the more you'll reflect, the more you'll self-reflect when you go home. And it's this period of self-reflection that allows for the building of synaptic connections. So self-assessment and self-reflection are fundamental to the learning process. So what is deliberate practice? And why do we consider the dominant form of learning today? Deliberate practice has three components. The first component is to define your learning objectives and your learning goals in a concrete, precise, and measurable way. Second component is to develop learning strategies in order to achieve your objectives and your goals. And the third and most important component is constant self-reflection. Are your strategies helping you achieve your learning goals? Why not? And if why not, if they're not helping you achieve your goals, then why are you not reformulating your strategies? Now, if this sounds familiar, it should be familiar. The reason why is that deliberate practice is really the application of the scientific process to learning, and that's what makes it so effective. And what Anders Ericsson talks a lot about is that what really drives learning, what really drives self-reflection is the idea of intrinsic motivation. But unfortunately, because of the idea of the 10,000-hour rule, our schools aren't structured around self-reflection. They're not really structured around giving kids the autonomy and the space in order for them to self-reflect. And the beauty of coronavirus, why coronavirus can be a blessing for us, is that it gives us this opportunity to reimagine learning, reimagine the school system, so that intrinsic motivation, autonomy, and self-reflection are built into the learning process. So the idea of intrinsic motivation, it's really key to learning online. And let me use the example of China to illustrate why. As we all know, China was really the first country to lock down its school system and to transition learning online. And for the most part, this transition has been fairly seamless. And it has been seamless for three distinct reasons. First of all, Chinese parents are heavily invested in their children's education. So parents will actively support their kids learning at home. Second is that for the past 10 years, Chinese school leaders have been very focused on developing a global ed tech system, so that when coronavirus hit, they were able to activate this system and transition learning online very effectively. And the third reason is that the Chinese school system is mainly focused on teaching knowledge and facts, which is fairly easy to do online. To illustrate how successful this transition has been, let me tell you a joke that was circulating on the Chinese internet way back in March of this year. The joke goes like this. A third grader was sitting at home during an online math class. Her mother was sitting beside her in their apartment, making sure the class went really well. The girl, the third grade girl, was engaging in conversation with her math teacher. Suddenly, there's some noise upstairs in the upstairs apartment. Someone's jumping rope. And that's distracting the girl. So the mother, being a very virtuous, very hands-on Chinese mother, she runs upstairs and knocks on the door. And she says to her upstairs neighbor, "Listen, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but my third grade daughter is doing a math class downstairs. Could you please keep it quiet? And the upstairs neighbor says to her, oh, I'm really sorry too. My daughter is now doing an online gym class and she has to skip rope. So that illustrates how successful this process has been. At the same time, it's revealed to us a fundamental feeling of the school system in China, namely that it's structured around extrinsic motivation. So from grades 1 until university, 50 kids sit in a classroom in China and they compete for the attention and for the praise of their teachers. And this system of extrinsic motivation is effective in focusing the attention and the energies of these students. The system breaks down online. So let me give you 2 examples to illustrate this. During coronavirus, teachers wanted kids to do homework. And so teachers tasked kids with downloading homework apps from app stores. And what the kids figured out is that if they actually went to these app stores and downvoted these homework apps would be automatically removed from the store, which meant no homework for the kids. The other thing that the kids were doing was figuring out which materials, which textbooks the teachers were using were pirated. And then going to companies whose copyrights were being infringed and reporting the pirating to them. And then the companies would launch formal complaints against these teachers, which led to teachers being locked out or shut down from their online platforms. So that gives you an example of how much more agile and much more adept at navigating the online world students are than their teachers. The reality is that in the classroom, students cannot rebel. But in the online world, students are very good at rebelling. They have 10,000 ways to disrupt learning and to piss off their teachers. So what this tells us is that in the online world, we need to reimagine and rebuild our school system so that students are intrinsically motivated and they're engaged and focused throughout the learning process. So how can we get kids to be intrinsically motivated learners online? To answer this question, let me ask another question. Why is it that kids around the world, they love playing video games? They can spend hours and hours doing it, but they all hate homework. They all complain and nag about it. The answer is in 3 components: autonomy, challenge, and feedback. Autonomy means that kids choose to play video games, whereas they're forced to do homework. Challenge means that video games will adapt the challenge to the ability of students. Video games will figure out the individual ability of the students and design challenges around the students. Whereas with homework, it's a one-size-fits-all model. So for the very best students, it's just very boring. But for students who need extra help, it can be too challenging. And feedback means that while playing video games, students are receiving instantaneous feedback, which helps them improve. And they enjoy the process of self-improvement. With homework, there's no feedback. So kids don't know how they're doing. And so my argument is that if we are to transition to an online learning model during a time of coronavirus, we need to incorporate these 3 elements: autonomy, challenge, and feedback into the learning process. We need to ensure that students, children, are the masters of their own learning and their own destiny. And what I want to argue now, what I want to show and illustrate is we can achieve this with the Learning Journal. So let me now explain what the Learning Journal is and how to go about implementing it. Here's the idea of the Learning Journal. Do yourself learning during coronavirus. Ask the student, what do you want to learn? Do you want to learn how to cook Thai food? Do you want to learn how to drive a car? Do you want to learn how to run a marathon? Do you want to learn how to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Do you want to learn a new programming language? Do you want to learn Swahili? It doesn't matter. Let the student decide his or her own learning path. It's not important what the student is learning. What's important is how the student learns. As teachers, we can ask our students to do a daily journal of the learning process. And this is what we call the Learning Journal. And the Learning Journal has 3 components. The first component is the student has to be able to define very precisely and in a measurable way what his or her learning objectives are. So let me give you an example of this. It's better for the student to say, I want to run a marathon in less than 4 hours, rather than to say, I want to finish first in a marathon. The second component of the Learning Journal is to write down the learning process, the learning strategy, learning plan. Think of this as a cooking recipe where you go step by step on how you will achieve your goal. And the third and most important component is for the student to collect data and engage in self-reflection and self-analysis and discuss ways he or she can improve. Now, what's really important to remember is that the teacher does not leave the learning process, but the teacher becomes a much more important part of the learning process. Rather than just direct learning, the teacher becomes a facilitator and a mentor. And the teacher has 3 major roles. The first role is to encourage and motivate the student. It's very easy in the beginning to be motivated and be passionate, but over time, this passion wanes. It's very important for the teacher to help the student stay motivated. Second role of the teacher is to look at the Learning Journal and provide very specific feedback, and identify problem areas or weaknesses so that the student can engage in much more precise, much more accurate self-reflection. And the third and most important role of the teacher is to constantly suggest new learning strategies. Now, as human beings, it's very easy for us to become too focused on a goal, an objective. If we want to run a marathon, we think, oh, all we have to do is run a lot every day and we'll achieve that goal. And our passion can sometimes make us too narrow-minded. And it's really a job of the teacher to make a step back and ask ourselves questions about our learning strategy. Have you tried lifting weights? Have you tried switching your sleep patterns? Have you tried switching your diet? Have you tried running with a friend? And these learning strategies will help us engage in much more deep self-reflection and also help us imagine our learning in a much more productive and efficient manner. Here, I want to give you 3 examples of the Learning Journal. And these examples are fairly easy to do, very straightforward, and they can be done in a short duration, 1 week to 1 month. And think of these Learning Journal examples as basically training wheels for learning how to ride a bike. they'll get you started. They'll teach you the process of how to engage in effective learning, and they'll motivate you to be more effective learners. So these three examples are this. Have kids engage in a physical challenge. For example, maybe say, do 500 burpees in an hour. And what's really useful about this sort of activity is that it helps kids better understand data collection. It's fairly easy and straightforward to collect data. It helps kids figure out how to use data in a much more effective manner. Second example is for kids to learn a board game, whether it's chess or maybe poker. A board game that I like a lot is called Hearthstone Battlegrounds. It's a video game. It's free to download from Blizzard Activision. And the beauty of learning a board game is that there are communities. There are communities that have risen out of these board games, and these communities are very good at teaching you how to master these board games. So, for example, with Hearthstone, there are many very good players who live stream their games online. And what they do online is that not only do they play the games, but they talk about the strategies. They talk aloud about how they think about the game. They're constantly self-reflecting. That's a very good habit for our students to pick up. The other great thing about Hearthstone and other video games is that it's fairly easy to track your improvement. They have a ranking system, and the more you listen to live streams, the more you self-reflect, the higher you climb in the rankings. And the third learning journal activity that kids can start with right away is learning how to cook or bake. And the beauty of learning how to cook or bake is that it enables you to self-diagnose fairly accurately. If you write a poem, it could be very bad, but you would never know because we as human beings are very adept at lying to ourselves. But if you bake a really bad meal, your senses will tell you that it's really bad, and it'll cause you to self-reflect and to improve your cooking. Let's talk about assessment. How do we know if the learning journal activity has been effective at teaching students meta learning strategies? And how do we know if the learning journal has helped the students actually learn the activity? Well, as an educator, what I've discovered is that the best way to assess how well a student has learned is to ask him or her to teach a material himself or herself. So my suggestion is to have the students do a 5-minute YouTube video as an output. And the 5-minute YouTube video, the content is the students sharing his or her learning journey and encouraging and teaching other people how to learn his or her new skill. And this is great because, one, it's a lot of fun. Students can be very creative in how they produce the videos. And two, it helps consolidate learning because to communicate effectively, they need to reflect deeply on the learning process. And three, they're getting active, immediate feedback from the peers, which also deepens self-reflection. Now that I've discussed the learning journal, now that I've shared the science behind the learning journal, what I would like to do now is discuss how we as a community can promote and advance the learning journal and promote and advance the teaching of meta-learning strategies in schools so that all children benefit. And here I want to suggest 3 possible ways we can collaborate. The first is if we together develop a website a learning journal community where everyone is sharing his or her learning journal, learning journey, and getting feedback and advice from peers. Think of this as really a database of learning journals. Second possible way to collaborate is based on this database of learning journals, we can co-develop a learning app that students can use on their mobile phones, which tracks the progress of his or her learning and offers real-time advice and feedback. And the third possible way we can collaborate is to design mental learning courses online for teachers and for students. And these online courses can be the template, can be a rubric for a new model of learning in schools. We're all hackers. We're all committed to using our expertise, our passion to help better the world. I think that coronavirus has presented us this amazing opportunity, this wonderful opportunity to remake, reimagine, and rebuild education for the better so that our schools become places of creativity, of learning, and our students are able to thrive in this new world. Thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions and to maintaining in close contact over the next few weeks, the next few months, next few years. This will be a very long journey, but I think that if we all work together, we will make tremendous strides in making our school systems much better.
That was a fascinating presentation. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts on the education system. We've had a tremendous set of questions in the Matrix chat, and we have maybe close to 10 minutes to try to work through as many as we can. I think maybe I'll start with a request for further information. Is there a website or a white paper, or how might people sort of follow up on some of the things that you've been speaking about?
The Learning Journal is an idea I've been playing with for the past few months because of coronavirus. I haven't really worked it out fully. I have, but I would love to start engaging hackers, the community, and see if we can build a prototype or figure out how to best advance the ideas. So the best way to contact me is over Twitter. I'm very active on Twitter. And hopefully we can start engaging each other and figure out how to best carry this idea forward.
Excellent. Thanks very much. That's a great offer for collaboration for those that would like to be a little more involved. There's a question about some of the differences in how participation is treated. So, and I don't know if it's the same in China or not, but in the US, we have this tendency of what we sometimes call participation trophies. The idea is that, and this is for kids, the idea is that every kid gets a trophy, every kid wins. And of course, that's a positive reinforcement. There's no doubt about that. What's your view on that versus, a more traditional approach of having, winners and losers and first place, second place, third place?
Right. So from what I know from my research, both systems are problematic. Participation trophies are part of the self-esteem movement, and Carol Dweck, a Stanford psychologist who wrote the book Mindset, she's done decades of research in showing the flaws of the self-esteem movement. Basically, kids don't like self-esteem. Kids don't like participation trophies. They see it as condescending. They see it as belittling, and it discourages them. It's very counterproductive. Rankings and competition is extremely unhealthy for kids. It destroys intrinsic motivation. It destroys curiosity. It destroys creativity. It destroys collaboration. The authority here would be Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote a book called Flow, F-L-O-W. But he's a leading expert on creativity and how creativity is driven by intrinsic motivation and how we need to avoid competition rankings. So the science here is pretty clear. Both the self-esteem movement and rankings are deeply flawed, and we need to focus more on intrinsic motivation. I think the bigger issue here is that never in human history have adults taken such control over the lives of children, right? I mean, this is unprecedented. We have participation trophies, we have competitions because this is what parents demand. It's not what kids want, it's what parents demand. Another example is homework. Never before in human history has children been inundated with so much homework. We have absolutely no evidence, by the way, that homework actually improves learning, but parents want it, so we give them homework. So right now, the education system around the world is driven by parental demand rather than the needs of children.
Wow, that's fascinating. So would you be against, or would you be against, for example, sports in general, like things where competition is sort of built in to the activity?
It depends on the age group. When children are young, I would be against organized sports. I believe that playing is vital to children's neurological development, and there's a lot of neuroscience that demonstrates this. I have a 2.5-year-old, and we just let him play every day. It's incredible the creativity he expresses just through play. So I feel that for young children, disorganized play, unorganized play is such a vital component of children's neurological development. I think that organized sports is something that they can move on to when they hit their teenage years. But I think before 12 years old, I would discourage organized sports.
Yeah, thank you. So a question that didn't come up in the chat, but it just occurred to me, bullying is really a big issue. And a lot of that comes from play and then comes from, I should say comes from, it takes place during play and takes place during organized sports and takes place in the classroom. Do you feel like, and I know this wasn't your main topic, but do you feel like emphasis on creativity might decrease bullying or give?
So we have pretty compelling evidence that bullying is a result of stress from adults, right? So when adults expect children to perform, they become very stressed and they take out that stress on other children. But if you just leave children alone, they don't bully each other. We have very compelling evidence that if you just leave children alone, they get along very, very, very well.
That's great. I think that's informative for people that are looking at how to handle these situations. We had a question about basically sort of copyright and how that's handled. I think everyone was entertained by the notion of the school children taking down apps and getting rid of the homework that way, and that's a great hack. I think Hackers on Planet Earth is encouraging of that approach. But at the same time, it's a little confusing because that would be perceived as a copyright or sort of a more severe issue, we think, in the US. How is that different? How is that sort of regime of property ownership and control maybe a little different in China?
Right. So, China subscribes to the same set of international copyright norms as the United States, right? The issue is one of enforcement. The United States has very strict enforcement regimes in place. China does not. In fact, you can make the argument that China has gotten very wealthy because China was able to use a lot of pirated technology from the West, right? And that's really the source of the US-China conflict right now. The US is demanding China better enforce copyright and stop stealing the United States intellectual property. So the issue here is one of enforcement, right? China subscribes to the same laws, but China doesn't have an enforcement regime. Enforcement is a lot easier to do online than it is offline, right? Because in the classroom, you don't have a public record, whereas online, you do have a public record. And that's why we're seeing a surge in students reporting on teachers. And companies, whose copyrighted art infringed obviously have vested interest in enforcing these copyright infringements.
Yeah, so it's different, but it sounds like some of the laws at least are similar. We had a question about endorphin simulation. I wonder if you can comment on that, particularly play versus online games, online learning, these types of things.
Right. So scientists have right now located 4 sources of chemicals, hormones that motivate people, right? Endorphins is what you get when you run a lot, right? First, physical exertion. You have dopamine as well. You have oxytocin and serotonin, okay? So these are the 4 chemicals that drive motivation. And what we know is that online games and offline games activate different parts of the brain system, right? So online games primarily activate dopamine system, which is linked with cocaine use, right? So the more you use, that's why online gaming is so addictive. Offline gaming, it depends on the game you use, but it's more endorphins, serotonin, much more healthy chemicals. And that's why it's because of physical touch, right? It's physical touch that activates these serotonin and oxytocin chemicals, hormones. And that's why we recommend for children, especially for children, it's so important for them to engage in outside play, especially activities that involve physical touch, right? Just any sort of roughhousing would help them.
To what extent do those chemicals feed into the creativity process, or does creativity create some of the same?
That's a good question. Again, the science is not clear, but we suspect that dopamine and creativity are actually in conflict. We believe that serotonin and oxytocin are more aligned with creativity, in that they drive creativity. Serotonin is more about lifelong personal relationships, and we know that is very heavily connected with creativity. Dopamine is more about extrinsic rewards, right? So if you score 100 on a math test, you have the surge of dopamine. But what we discovered is that actually conflicts with the brain's creative systems. So, but again, the science is not clear about this, but what we do know is that the more time we play with each other in games, offline, the more creative we become. And the more we play video games online, the less creative we become. That's what we suspect right now.
Wow, yeah, that's stark. And as you say, that the research is still emerging, but this is what we seem to be.
This is neuroscience. This is neuroscience. Actually, the chemicals, how they interplay with each other, and how that drives creativity. I mean, it's still up in the air right now.
Okay, and then to make sure I understand, I think what you're saying there is that what really is a downside of online gaming also applies to online learning. Oh, I've lost connectivity there. Is it just me, or did we lose connectivity? Is it just me, or did we lose connectivity?
Sorry, I got cut off. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, did you hear my question? It's really our last question, and I think it's yeah, the last question is whether what you're really saying is the research makes it seem like the negative side of online gaming and the addictive characteristics and the neurochemical characteristics, these are the same types of outcomes with online learning.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, people play a lot more online games than they do online learning, right? So we have actually no evidence that online learning actually benefits kids. Where the evidence is online learning actually helps with teacher training. So if you're a teacher and you're looking for new pedagogical practices, if you're looking to upgrade your knowledge set, online learning is great. It's something that you can do intrinsically by yourself. But with online learning, what's really important is to ensure that kids are intrinsically motivated and they're not being forced to do it. Otherwise, it's absolutely no benefit. We have absolutely no evidence that online learning benefits students. They benefit teachers actually more than they benefit students.
It's fascinating. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time. We'll have to wrap up. I really appreciate you joining us. I enjoyed your presentation. There's a lot of tremendous response and input on these topics. And because education is it's a topic that's near and dear to all of us. We all went through the system and we all like it to be better. I appreciate your thoughts. Yeah, it's not an overstatement to say that it is everything. Well, thanks again, and have a super rest of the hope. And I do hope that you have further communication via Twitter and elsewise to work on this learning journal concept.
Great, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.